He told a generation how to survive. He mapped the streets of Compton with such devastating precision that a Pulitzer Prize committee, the same institution that had spent a century handing gold seals to poets and novelists and composers of orchestral movements, stopped what it was doing and said, This is literature. This is the thing." And then, quietly, while the world placed him on a pedestal so high, the air thinned around it, he sat in a therapist's office and admitted that he did not know how to love another human being without destroying them. That he had been broken in ways the music had never fully named. That the boy who memorized every street corner in Compton and turned them into scripture had never managed to find peace on any of them, including the ones inside his own chest. Kendrick Lamar Duckworth. The greatest rapper alive, they say. The conscience of a generation. The man who stood on a Super Bowl stage in February 2025 in front of 133 million people and performed not a celebration, but a reckoning. Not a halftime show, but a trial, and made the most watched sporting event in American history feel like church. Like the kind of church where the sermon is about your specific sins, where the pastor knows your name. But what does it cost a man to carry an entire people's pain as his artistic material? What happens to the soul of someone who has to reach into the darkest rooms of his own history every time the world asks him to create? What is the price of being not just great, but necessary? And what does it mean when the man who built his legacy on radical honesty finally turns that honesty on himself and does not entirely like what he finds? Before we answer any of that, we need to go back. Back before the Pulitzer, back before the Super Bowl, back before Not Like Us broke the internet and made a cultural villain out of the most famous man in hip-hop. Back to a street in Compton, California, where a small boy stood on a sidewalk in the summer of 1995 and watched two men film a music video. One of them was Dr. Dre, the other was Tupac Shakur. The boy was 7 years old. And something happened to him that afternoon that neither man would ever know about, and that would take him 3 decades to fully understand. Compton, California, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, was not a place. It was a condition. A 10-square-mile city south of Los Angeles where the crack epidemic had rewritten the social contract, where gang territories were drawn in blood on sidewalks and alley walls, where the median household income told one story and the body count told another. It was a city that the rest of America had decided to look away from, and in doing so, had created a pressure cooker of grief and fury and extraordinary human resilience that would eventually explode outward in the form of a sound the world called gangster rap, and a generation of young men who translated survival into art with a directness that no conservatory had ever taught, and no institution had ever expected. Kendrick Lamar Duckworth was born on June 17, 1987, at Centinela Hospital in Inglewood, the second child of Kenny Duckworth and Paula Oliver. His father had migrated west from Chicago, carrying the particular DNA of a city that had its own complicated relationship with violence and ambition. Kenny Duckworth had been affiliated with the Gangster Disciples in Chicago before relocating to Compton, where the gang landscape was different, but the physics were the same: loyalty, territory, consequence. His mother, Paula, was a woman of fierce love and limited options, navigating the mathematics of raising children in a zip code that the American dream had decided to skip. They lived on Rosecrans Avenue. The address itself was an education, a block-by-block atlas of everything the civil rights movement had promised, and the decades afterward had systematically dismantled. Kendrick grew up watching. That was, by every account of those who knew him then, his primary activity. He watched, he listened, he cataloged. The older boys on the corners, the arguments that spilled out of screen doors on hot nights, the way his father moved through the world with the particular wariness of a man who had calculated the odds and understood they were not in his favor. By the time he was in elementary school, Kendrick had already absorbed the fundamental curriculum of Compton, that belonging to something was the only protection available, and that the price of that belonging was the permanent suspension of the self. You were your block. You were your set. You were the color on your back. The idea that you might also be a poet, a philosopher, a future recipient of America's most prestigious literary prize. That idea would have gotten you laughed off the corner so completely you might never recover from it. But Kendrick watched something else too. He watched his father come home. Not every father on Rosecrans came home. Some were taken by the streets. Some were taken by the system. Some simply left and didn't come back. Kenny Duckworth, for all his complications, came home. And in a neighborhood where absence was the dominant paternal condition, that presence, imperfect, weighted with its own history, but undeniably there, planted something in his son that would not fully bloom for years. Here is a question worth sitting with. What did your childhood teach you that you had to unlearn as an adult? Because for Kendrick Lamar, the unlearning would take decades, and it would happen publicly, in front of millions, in ways he neither planned nor fully controlled. Leave a comment below, because that question is at the exact center of this story. The summer afternoon when 7-year-old Kendrick stood on a Compton sidewalk and watched Dr. Dre and Tupac Shakur film the video for California Love is one of the founding myths of his biography. He has spoken about it across multiple interviews, and what strikes every person who hears it is the specificity of what he says he felt in that moment. Not awe at celebrity, not the dazzlement of proximity to fame. Something more urgent than that. A recognition, a sense barely articulable in a child's vocabulary that the world he was standing in, the streets, the sun, the particular golden light of a Compton afternoon, was worth something. That it could be made into something. That someone could look directly at this life, this specific and overlooked and brutal and beautiful life, and not look away. Tupac Shakur was murdered 13 months later. Shot 4 times in Las Vegas on September 7, 1996. He was 25 years old. Kendrick was 9. He would later say that Tupac's death was the first time he truly understood that the world did not protect the people he needed it to protect. That greatness offered no immunity. That the streets extracted their toll without consideration for what the person being taken might have still had to say. He started writing at 13. Notebooks first, then crude recordings on whatever equipment he could access. His parents were not opposed. They understood early that their son was doing something with his mind that warranted space, even if they couldn't yet name what it was. His early recordings circulated locally under the name m.A.A.d. They were raw, technically unrefined, but everyone who heard them noticed the same quality. An intelligence in the construction, a refusal to simplify, a voice that seemed to understand not just the surface of its subject matter, but the sediment beneath it. By 16, he had caught the attention of Anthony Tiffith, known universally as Top Dog, who would become the founder and CEO of Top Dog Entertainment, the independent record label that would eventually house some of the most critically significant artists in contemporary music. Top Dog signed the teenager, not because he had a commercial product ready to deliver, but because he recognized something rarer and harder to manufacture than marketability. A perspective, a way of seeing the world that was so singular it could not be taught and could not be imitated without immediately revealing itself as imitation. Dave Free, his closest friend from childhood, would eventually become his creative partner, co-president of their management and production company. Theirs was the particular bond that forms only in adolescence in high-stakes environments, a friendship forged not merely by proximity and shared taste, but by the mutual understanding that they were each other's best shot at getting out in one piece. Not out of Compton geographically, necessarily, but out of the future that Compton's statistical trajectory had already written for them. What stops you from becoming the person your environment predicted you'd be? Think about that, because Kendrick Lamar had every actuarial reason to become a different story entirely, and the question of what redirected him, and what it took to maintain that redirection, and what it cost, is the question that all of his music is ultimately trying to answer. His early mixtapes, overly dedicated in 2010, in particular, began to circulate beyond Compton, beyond Los Angeles, beyond the geography of their creation. Hip-hop's informal critical infrastructure, the bloggers and journalists, and fellow artists who function as the first listeners, started using words that felt disproportionate for someone who had not yet released a major label record. Genius, they said. Important. The kind of thing that only comes along once in a very long time. In 2011, he released Section .80, a concept album about a generation, his generation, the children born in the late 1980s to parents broken by crack and policy, and the slow withdrawal of the social safety net. And the music industry paid attention in the way it pays attention when something it did not commission begins to matter more than everything it did. Dr. Dre signed him to Aftermath Entertainment. The boy who had stood on a sidewalk watching Dre film a video was now signed to Dre's label. Life has a sense of narrative architecture that novelists rarely achieve. And then, in 2012, Good Kid, M.A.A.d. City. A masterpiece is a word that criticism deploys casually and frequently, thereby draining it of meaning on most occasions. This was one of the occasions where it applied without inflation. A concept album told as a day in the life of a teenage Kendrick navigating Compton. The temptations, the violence, the love, the near-death experiences, the particular grace that sometimes descends on people in impossible circumstances and redirects them without their full understanding of why. It debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200. It was eventually certified 6 times platinum. It made Kendrick Lamar not just famous, but undeniable. Not just successful, but significant. The kind of significant that gets discussed in classrooms. But success arrived carrying something no classroom discussion ever adequately addresses. It arrived carrying the people he had left behind. Have you ever made it somewhere and then had to figure out what you owed the people who didn't? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the actual moral architecture of Kendrick Lamar's entire creative output from 2012 onward. The guilt of survival, the weight of a zip code that the world had decided was only useful for producing cautionary tales, and the determination to make it produce something else, while also being honest about what it did to the people who stayed, and to the people who got out, and to the distance between those two categories that never fully closes, no matter how many awards you accumulate. He had lost people, not abstractions, specific people, friends and family members claimed by the streets he had mapped so precisely in his music. Each loss added a new layer to the architecture of grief that his work was built on, a foundation that kept expanding even as the structure above it climbed higher and higher into the light. In 2015, To Pimp a Butterfly arrived and did to the music industry what a flood does to a landscape. It rearranged everything. A jazz-inflected, funk-saturated, politically incendiary, personally devastating album that arrived in March 2015. 9 days after the anniversary of Selma, 9 months after Ferguson, 12 years into a war that had quietly destroyed the credibility of the government that prosecuted it, and sounded like it had been made specifically for that exact moment by someone who had been watching it coming for years. Because it had been. Because he had. The opening track contained the lines that would follow Kendrick Lamar into every profile and every retrospective for the next decade. A prose poem written from inside the psyche of a young black man ascending through a white institution, cataloging the accumulation of petty victories and quiet humiliations that compose such a journey, and arriving at a final declaration that was not triumph, but interrogation. I remember you was conflicted, misusing your influence. Sometimes I did the same. That last sentence is the one that matters. The willingness to indict himself with the same precision he brought to indicting everyone else. It was not a posture. It was not the performative self-flagellation of someone trying to seem humble. It was the genuine and unsettling recognition that proximity to power changes people, that the systems you ascend through leave their fingerprints on you whether you consent to them or not, and that greatness does not exempt anyone from the requirement of accounting for themselves. In 2017, damn 6 monosyllabic letters and a period that functioned as a full stop against everything the critical consensus had assumed about where he was going next. A harder, more compressed record. Less jazz, more trap, more personal and simultaneously more opaque. It debuted at number 1. It was nominated for the Album of the Year Grammy, which it did not win, in a moment that generated genuine public outrage among music critics who had perhaps never felt that strongly about a Grammy before and would perhaps not feel that strongly again. And in April 2018, it won the Pulitzer Prize for Music. The Pulitzer Prize Selection Committee described it as a virtuosic song collection, unified by its vernacular authenticity and rhythmic dynamism that offers affecting vignettes, capturing the complexity of modern African American life. Which is one way of saying it. Another way of saying it is that a kid from Rosecrans Avenue in Compton had written something so true and so complete and so formally accomplished that the oldest literary prize in America had no choice but to acknowledge it, even though doing so required them to expand their definition of what literature was allowed to be. He was 30 years old. But here is what the Pulitzer Prize does not prepare you for. Here is what no amount of critical consensus or commercial validation or gold-frame certificates on a wall can protect you from. The quiet that comes after. The moment when the ceremony is over and the champagne is flat and you are alone with the voice that has been speaking through your music for 15 years. The voice that is more honest than you are in any other context of your life. And it is asking you a question you have been avoiding for a very long time. What about you? In 2022, Kendrick Lamar released Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. He had been largely silent for 5 years, the longest gap between studio albums of his career, a silence that the internet filled with theories and speculation, and the particular anxiety of people who have come to depend on an artist's voice in ways they did not fully intend. When the album arrived, it did not deliver what the wait had seemed to promise. It did not arrive as a triumph. It arrived as a confession booth. A 2-disc reckoning with everything the music had touched around but never fully entered. The trauma at the center of his childhood. A family member's sexual abuse that he had absorbed as a child and never spoken publicly about. His own infidelity within the relationship that had been his anchor for his entire adult life. His patterns of emotional withholding, his tendency to aestheticize pain rather than sit inside it, and the discovery, made in therapy, named in therapy, worked on in therapy, that he had been performing healing for years without doing it. "I choose me, I'm sorry," he said on the closing track, and the world spent weeks trying to decide whether that was selfishness or the most radical act of self-preservation they had ever heard a public figure perform. Whitney Alford has been at Kendrick's side since they were teenagers in Compton. She is not a music industry figure. She is not a celebrity. She is, by every available account, the person who knew him before any of it, before the albums, before the Pulitzer, before the Super Bowl, and chose to stay through all of it, including the years when staying required weathering things that would have ended most relationships with less foundation. They are engaged. They have 2 children together, and on Mr. Morale, Kendrick did something that very few artists at his level have ever done. He told the truth about what he had put her through, on record, with her knowledge and participation, without softening the edges. Think about that for a moment. The man who built his entire artistic identity on radical honesty, on looking directly at the worst things and refusing to flinch, finally turned that lens on his own intimate life and found that the person he had been least honest with was the person who had been closest to him all along. What does that do to a man? What does it do to a relationship? And what does it say about the particular cost of turning your pain into art when the people who love you have been living inside that pain all along? Drop your thoughts below, because that question does not have a clean answer, and the fact that it does not is exactly why the album spent months generating the kind of conversation that music rarely generates anymore. The beef with Drake arrived in public in early 2024, though its roots were older and more complicated than a simple dispute between two successful men. Drake, born Aubrey Graham in Toronto, had for a decade occupied a position in mainstream hip-hop that Kendrick found philosophically irreconcilable with what he believed the music was supposed to be and supposed to do. Their tension had been audible for years in lyrics and interviews and the particular coded language of artists who respect and resent each other simultaneously. What happened in the spring of 2024 was the detonation of that tension in the most public possible way. Kendrick released 5 diss tracks in the space of weeks. Drake responded. The internet, which by 2024 had developed highly efficient infrastructure for processing cultural events in real time, treated it with the intensity usually reserved for elections or disasters. Not Like Us, released on May 4, 2024, became the fastest charting diss track in the history of the Billboard Hot 100. It contained allegations so specific and so serious that the legal aftermath would extend for years. Drake filed lawsuits. Kendrick performed the song at his own Juneteenth concert in Inglewood to 60,000 people screaming every word back at him. But what no one quite said loudly enough in the months of analysis that followed was what the ferocity of Kendrick's response revealed. Not just about Drake, about Kendrick, the precision of the fury, the willingness to use every tool available, lyrical, cultural, personal, to dismantle someone completely. The man who had spent a decade asking the world to hold its institutions accountable, who had recorded therapy sessions and confessed to his own moral failures on his last album, was also capable of something that looked, in certain lights, very much like a scorched earth campaign. He had not transcended the street-level logic of his origin. He had sublimated it into something more sophisticated, and when the moment came, it was still there, intact and fully functional. I had to get it out of my system, he told an interviewer afterward, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who is neither proud nor entirely ashamed. And in those 7 words was more psychological honesty than most people manage in a year. February 9th, 2025. Super Bowl 59 halftime show. New Orleans, Louisiana. Kendrick Lamar took the stage in front of 133 million television viewers and performed for 13 minutes that were received by critics as the finest halftime show in the event's history, and by cultural commentators as something stranger and more significant than a halftime show is supposed to be. He wore red. He performed a set that was organized not as a greatest hits package, but as a statement about blackness, about America, about the distance between the country's promises and its practices, about what it means to stand on the most visible stage in American culture and refuse to be entertainment. He invited Samuel L. Jackson. He invited Serena Williams. He brought his children onto the stage. And at the end, in an image that became the most discussed photograph of the night, he stood at the center of a field that had been transformed into the shape of the American flag, and raised his arms while pyrotechnics erupted behind him, and the expression on his face was not triumph. It was something harder to name. The face of a man who had arrived somewhere he had been heading his entire life and was not sure, in that exact moment, whether arriving was the same thing as being free. Here is what Kendrick Lamar's story reveals beneath the albums and the accolades and the cultural warfare. It reveals that survival is not a destination. It is a continuous labor, performed daily, in private, in ways that no award can measure and no audience can witness. The boy from Compton, who memorized every corner of a city that America had decided didn't matter, went on to make that city the most scrutinized geography in contemporary literature. He did it by refusing the lie of simplicity, the lie that said his streets were only one thing, that the people on them were only one thing, that he was only one thing. But it also reveals that the tools which allow a person to survive extraordinary circumstances, the hypervigilance, the emotional compartmentalization, the transmutation of pain into productivity, do not automatically convert into the tools required for ordinary happiness, for intimacy, for the kind of love that does not ask anything of you except your presence. He has said in interviews, without bitterness and without resolution, that he is still figuring it out, That therapy has given him language for things he could not previously name. That Whitney's patience has outlasted his understanding of what he did to earn it. That his children look at him in a way that nothing else in his life has ever managed to produce. Without expectation, without history, without the accumulated weight of everything he has been to everyone else for 37 years. They just want their father to be in the room. He is 37 years old. He has a Pulitzer Prize. He has a Super Bowl. He has an artistic legacy that is, by reasonable consensus, already secured regardless of what he does next. He has a family that has survived things that most families do not survive. He is in therapy. He is working. He is, by the evidence available, still becoming something, and the particular quality of that becoming, the willingness to remain unfinished rather than settle into the monument the world keeps trying to make him, may be the most important thing about him. The boy who stood on a Compton sidewalk in 1995 watching greatness move through his neighborhood did not grow up to be Tupac. He grew up to be something the culture didn't have a template for yet. A man who made greatness not out of mythology, but out of accountability. Not out of invincibility, but out of the willingness to be, in public, in the music, and increasingly in the life, exactly as damaged and determined and honest as he actually was. The map of Compton he drew was always also a map of himself, and the territory it charted is still being explored. If this story moved you, if something in Kendrick's journey reflected something in your own, the weight of where you came from, the cost of becoming who you needed to be, the distance between the person you perform and the person you actually are, leave a like. Subscribe so you never miss the stories that matter. And tell us in the comments, which Kendrick Lamar album hit you the hardest and why? Because the answer to that question says something true about where you were when you needed it. And the fact that you needed it at all says something true about him. Because the greatest thing Kendrick Lamar ever made was not an album. It was the decision to keep being honest about how difficult it is to be a person. And that decision, made again every day in the quiet of a life no camera can fully reach, is the work that will outlast every platinum certification and every Pulitzer commendation and every crowd that ever chanted his name back at him under the lights. Keep going. Even when the map runs out, especially then.